Hello, peeps. Welcome back to another episode of the Fly Shit and Scholarship Podcast. I am your host. It's Dr. Mish. And today with us, we have the lovely Dr. Kristen McGue. Hello, Dr. McGue. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. So excited to have you and so excited to sort of learn more about what you do and to share that with the audience. So really quickly, Dr. Kristen McGue is a licensed psychologist specializing in value-based cognitive behavior therapy for adolescents, young adults, and families. Currently practicing in New Jersey, Dr. McGue focuses on empowering clients to build resilience, make meaningful change, and lead fulfilling lives. Beyond therapy, she's an advocate for mental wellness and provides talks and trainings to promote values-based living across the lifespan. Hi, how are you?
Well, thank you. I'm good. And thank you for having me.
Yes. It's a pleasure for sure. I really appreciate. I met Dr. McGue just through a random sort of reaching out via email. She reached out, and I think that that's a bigger conversation to have at another time, just about how we network and not being afraid to network and understanding that there's enough for us all. And I think that that's such a beautiful thing to just be able to say, hey, I know that we do similar work, but what are some ways that we can work together? And so I really, really appreciate the email and sort of us connecting in this space. So tell us a little bit more about you and how you got here to be a psychologist, and a little bit more about your target population.
Sure. So I've kind of always well, I won't say always. I have since about eighth grade wanted to be a psychologist, but at the time I thought it was because I could have flexible hours, which I do, and fancy shoes, which I don't. Oh, and talk to people because I think I've always been pretty like in my friend group, I was always the friend that everyone talked to. And I said, well, if I could get paid for this, that would be nice. And so even though the shoes didn't come, I said, let me go to school for that. And so I actually went to San Francisco State University in California for undergrad. I'm from California originally. And then I went to Howard University for graduate school. Yes, HU, you know. And so I took a lot of time to kind of think about the kind of psychologist I wanted to be through those different training opportunities. I actually worked at a group home for, I guess, youth who were ages 10 to about 13 who were struggling with mental health and needed to be in more of a therapeutic setting, but really landed with children because I found that, at least for me, from my perspective, kids are so open and ready to do things in a different way, and they're used to learning. And not to say that adults can't or won't, but at the time when I was deciding, I felt like that's where I could have more of the more access to like the change process, right? Because people are a little bit more willing and more open. I also found that in my experiences that were clinical, that it was often that the families were really happy and like willing to be receptive to a lot of the suggestions that we were making in those different sessions. And so that felt easier. Whereas I feel like adults tended to be a little bit more entrenched in how they were doing things. And so a little bit more trouble kind of making the progress that it felt like it was helpful to see at the time. I do think that that has changed since I've been, a young college student, but at the time, that's how I made that choice. And then decided to get more postdoctoral training and things like that in children and families. And so that's where I work now.
Makes sense. And so, what does your sort of ideal client look like, right? So, you are currently working with both children and families, and sort of some work with both sort of groups combined. What's your ideal client?
Yeah. So I actually find myself really drawn to clients who are they could have a range of different mental health issues. So I have a background where I generalize and work with kids who have anxiety or mood disorders or ADHD. So a lot of that. But really, the kids that I find myself most drawn to are the ones just trying to like figure out life. And whether that means they're trying to decide, how do I move from elementary school to middle school? And like, what does that mean? Or different aspects of their identity, how to exist and maintain and, strengthen relationships that they have, whether it's with parents or with peers. And so they're kind of in the middle of trying to figure something out. And they might have some other things that make that difficult for them. But I find that values-based work really works well for those kids.
Yeah. Can you tell us more when you say values-based work? What does that mean?
Sure. So I am, and I'll start with, I am trained as a cognitive behavioral psychologist. And so what we usually are working on is trying to figure out how thoughts, feelings, and behaviors relate to each other and how we can use that to help folks figure out how to feel better, essentially, what
Mm-hmm.
traditional cognitive behavior therapy is about. Um, I would say in the last 15 or so years, just about, values-based interventions have become more and more and more popular, although they existed previous to that, whether it's dialectical behavior therapy or
Mm.
acceptance and commitment therapy. Those kinds of interventions are still cognitive because they still are concerned with thoughts and how they relate, how people relate to their thoughts and how that makes them feel or how that makes them behave. But really, when we're focused on values, we take ourselves out of just trying to change thoughts so much
Mm.
and to understand why those thoughts are happening, and
Mm.
also how people can behave in a way, even if they do have a thought that says, oh, I'm not having a good day today, or I feel lazy. How do you still do something that's important to you in spite of or in the context of that thought, right?
Yeah.
So when I work with kids and families, it's a lot about how do you move past the things that you're feeling or the things that you're thinking so that you can do what's valued to you and have the life that you want.
I love that. I love that. What ways do you see that impacting kids the most, right? So
Mhm.
when I think of kids, I'm going from the smallest of the smallest up
Yes,
until sort of like high school and merging into college. So
sure.
in what way has this sort of idea of incorporating the value base is that working for kids? Because my thought is there is such a transition in the things that we value over time and based on just sort of when we're born, right? How old we are, when we were raised, where we were raised. And so,
Yeah.
how have you seen this sort of framework essentially and merging that with CBT be super helpful for kids?
Yeah. And I'm glad you asked that because I do think that when kids are a lot younger, people go, well, they don't have values or they value what their parents value or like what. And it also does change over time. And so when I'm dealing with kids, even really under the age of 10, I would say generally they're in sort of like values formation. You know what's important to them because they will cry about it. So like if you took their favorite toy, that's what they value that day. And so their values might not be as sort of esoteric, as an adult, but it really does help to understand that they do have things that are important to them and that they matter. And so when we're in therapy, even though we're not directly assessing them the way that I might for a kid who was a bit older, it really is something to say, like, what's important to you or why did you do that, as opposed to just saying they're being, non-compliant, they're not following directions. No, it's because such and such mattered to them more in that moment. And so how do we work with that? Also at that age, we're working a lot more with parents to say, what do they value and how can they use what's important to them and what the goals they have for their families or themselves as parents to make parent choice decisions, as
Mm.
opposed to just doing stuff in the moment that feels right because I'm frustrated or because my mom did this and so I'll do that. You really want to be able to kind of take that intentionality into
Yeah.
parenting and be more mindful about how you're doing and mindful about what the child is bringing to the table so that you can parent them well. And so that's at that age. When we get a little older and they start having their own values and start developing their own unique perspectives, it's really the sense of tapping them into those values. I
Mm.
think a lot of times we are not as aware, even as adults, as we should be about the things that matter and are important. We're usually on autopilot. We're going to school because we have to, or we turn in the project because, oh, well, I needed the grade. But really finding out what about that particular project mattered to you, or when it comes to the household and chores, like, do you value keeping things neat and tidy, or is it more about respect and responsibility, or is it, and so whatever it is that is important to them in that specific moment, really tapping them into that gives them a behavioral choice that is different than I don't feel like it, or
Mm.
I'm lazy. And even if you are, that means that you can move past that. So I give the example to parents all the time of, if you don't want to get up and go for a walk in the morning because you decided, you committed, new year, new me. If you've decided that you get up in the morning and you're tired, does that mean you don't go? Probably, if all you focused on was that you're tired. But if you said, no, I value health, this is really important to me to move my body, I feel better when I do it, you might not walk right then. You might wait 15 extra minutes. You might try to like pump yourself with some music before you go out. But in that moment, you figure out a way to incorporate what's important to you, as opposed to just doing what you feel like doing or doing what your thought told you to do.
Yeah, that is so good because I think as an adult, we get so used to the concept of there's structure, there's rules, there's things that I want my kids to do, that ways in which I want my kids to behave and things that I want them to do. And not necessarily realizing that a lot of that comes from our sort of backgrounds and
Yeah.
growing up and how we were raised. And so, like you were saying, first, it's a thought of, why do I have the values that I have,
Amen.
right? And were they ones that were created for me, or were
Yeah.
they ones that I've developed on my own? And then how does that influence the way that I'm interacting with other people, and in this instance with my child, right? And as
Right.
you're saying that, I'm instantly thinking about like what life was like growing up for me, right? So
Yeah.
there were certain things in my household that we just did and or could not do because of my mother's parenting. So
Yeah.
leaving dishes in the sink, making sure that the house was clean. Like my mother ran the type of household where she's like, the house looks a mess. And it's just like,
Yeah.
girl, where? Like, I don't see nothing. There's nothing anywhere, right? Like everything is clean. But that's the household that she ran. And so as an adult, I've sort of taken on that same perspective. And
Uh-huh.
I've never considered like, why was that a thing for my mom, right? And so I got older and I started to realize like, oh, yes, some of this is because my mom taught me to clean up behind myself, or my mom taught me that the house needed to be sort of like this open door policy because she's from the South. So
Yeah.
for my mom, her whole thing growing up when she was 6 and 7 years old in North Carolina, and then with my grandma moving to DC, was this whole like, at any time somebody can walk in your house, right?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
took that on, but then as an adult, I started to realize, okay, there's a piece of that. But the reason why I like things organized is because I value peace. I value not
Yeah.
having a bunch of clutter. And so thinking about how we can teach, okay, to a child,
Right.
well, what do you value about cleaning your room? What do you value about washing your dishes? Or what do you value about listening to your mom or don't, right? I think is a
Right.
big
Yeah.
benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so different too, right? Like to know, one, where it comes from, because sometimes we're just doing stuff because we need to do the things, because we'll get in trouble if we won't, to be fair. And so you're right that it's one of those things that if it is because you value peace, the way that you go about cleaning is actually going to be very different than if you are doing it because you really, really want to make sure that company can come over. Same behavior, but it's coming from a different place. And
Mm-hmm.
especially when it's your value and you're doing it because you value it, no one has to tell you twice, right? You might have to motivate yourself to do it, but it's not going to be an argument and a battle to get to do it. And so I always, especially when kids are getting into the, preteen years, I always really encourage parents to not get into that mindset of, you do it because I said, as opposed to really, no, let me tell you why it's important to me so that you know where it came from. And so then you can make the choice about how to interact with it. Are you doing it because I said to? And when you turn 18, you won't do that anymore. Or are
Mm-hmm.
you going to take it forward past when you leave the house, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's also a solid point too, which is the whole because I said so. I
Uh-huh.
hate hearing people say that. And I hate hearing parents say it to children, and not because I don't get where they're coming from, right? I don't have children myself as of now, but I know as an adult that when I reflect back on moments where my mom said not to do something and she just said because I said so, in the moment it was very, very frustrating. And it was likely that I either didn't listen and did what I wanted to do anyway, or was very frustrated. It wasn't until I became an adult later
Uh-huh.
on when I'm able to sort of unpack her reasoning at the time. But
Uh-huh.
to wait so many years in hindsight, it doesn't
Right.
do us any good. And
Right.
sometimes I think parents lead with because I said so, because it's the easier option rather
Uh-huh.
than sitting in their own thoughts to truly figure out why is it that I'm asking you to do this thing, right? And there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with kids being inquisitive to ask questions.
Right.
Like, you want your kids to ask questions. You want your kids to inquire about why they have to do said task or behave said way, because those are the things, similar to your point, those are the things that will carry them, right? Those
Yeah.
foundational value systems, like you're saying, that will
Yeah.
say, like, oh, okay, I can't do this because it'll impact this person or it'll impact me in this sort of way. And that'll carry on. But just saying,
Right.
because I don't want you to, or because I said so, it just doesn't necessarily
Yeah.
benefit them in any kind of way.
Absolutely. And I tell parents this all the time because usually that does come out of, I'm frustrated right now. Just do what I said fast because I need you to do it. But being able to focus on the connection that you have with your kid and the relationship, and to understand that they didn't come here knowing what we think of as disrespectful or we think of as, the right way to do things and the way you approach an adult. That's your stuff. And so you really want to be able to say, they don't know why I'm asking this. Hold on, let me think about it, because maybe they don't know. It's funny. I want to say it was a TED Talk I was listening to, but the person was saying like that one of the things that they were trying to get out of is just doing things out of like remote behavior. And so they had this pot roast thing that they would cut off the ends of the pot roast and stick it in the pot, and they didn't realize why they were doing that. And so they asked their mom, and the mom said, well, I did it because grandma did it. I don't know. And then grandma was like, well, actually, my mom used to do that because they only had but so big of a pot. And
Mm.
so they were cutting off the good meat and putting it in a big pot because now they have a different size pot, but they were just doing it because they had always done it and not questioned it. And so by not asking the question, your child is just kind of doing stuff in the world and not being purposeful about it. And if you think about it, that's the worst case scenario. We want them creatively interacting with these things so that they can be mindful adults, right? And more than anything, and as a parent of a 6 and a 3, I remind myself of this all the time. They are 6 and 3 now. They won't be always. And so we want to make sure that when they're growing, that they're either able to understand why they were doing stuff or question it. And the first person they get to question is me. And so the more you allow that process to happen, then when, things come up later and they're like, wait a minute, this doesn't feel right, or I don't understand this, that they actually get to ask the question. And so really being open to that process, I believe, is part of what makes the parent-child relationship work better.
Yeah. What have you seen as one of the barriers to parents being able to access that area of the brain, right? To say, like, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I hear this idea that I should be okay with providing a reasonable response, right? I should be
Um,
okay with my kid asking questions. Like, I hear you and I'm going to
yeah.
try. But then they come back to you and they say, it's not working, girl. Like, it's not working. So, what have you seen as some of the most common barriers to them being able to access that sort of reasoning or line of thinking?
Yeah, I will say the most common two things. There's usually two. It's either something in the realm of that is disrespectful. So, yes, I hear what you're saying, but also in the moment, I'm triggered. Like that doesn't actually work. And so we end up working a lot on respect and disrespect, what that means to you. Um, is your child globally disrespectful, or is this question the only thing that's coming up? And then how do we fix that so that you can respond and react to it differently? Because again, when you're going into values-based intervention, it's saying like, yes, you're going to have the thought. I'm not even going to try to change it necessarily. What I actually do want you to do is respond to it differently, right? Or you're having a feeling come up, and so we're going to respond to that differently. The second one, I almost set myself up, that it is feeling that I am so frustrated. I'm so overwhelmed. I had this and this and this going on this morning. They're asking me this at night. I'm exhausted. So some version of I'm tired, I'm hungry, or I'm overwhelmed emotionally. And then we're talking a lot more about how you self-soothe as a parent. And it almost makes it seem like it's their responsibility only to like sort of have this time to like, really do self-care, which we think of as massage and like get your nails done or like whatever. But it's really more, how do I take a deep breath in the moment? How do I, okay, let me go take some space. Let me take a lap around the house before I make a choice, knowing that I don't have to respond right now. Even though at work, maybe I did have to be on my feet, like I'm going to be their parent forever. And so as long as I'm their parent, I have an opportunity. As long as we have connection, we always have another opportunity to do it over. And so let's wait till Saturday to talk about this so that you're not parenting in this sort of fight or flight phase.
That is so good. That is so good. And I know that I keep saying that, but I'm just sort of thinking about that practice of it, right? The hurry up to respond, the hurry up to address, and how I'm just thinking for myself, right? Like how that's a lot to work through, because I think we are so used to something's happening, you need to respond, you need to figure out how to address it, and then figuring things out. But I love the idea of like, even with your children, you can decide I'm not going to deal with this right now, right? Like we will tolerate, we will have this discussion later. We will tolerate all of our feelings and emotions at a later time when I have sort of come down or decompressed and thought through my own feelings, right? I think that what I hear or what I've heard from parents in both practice and like whether it's my god sisters and their kids is sort of like this what about me concept, right? Which I don't think enough parents recognize that you can hold space for yourself. And I think that's what you're describing. Like you can hold space and recognizing I've had a long day. I've been working. I'm now frustrated with my child and I don't have to respond to this right now. I can sit and think and sort of craft like what my emotions are about this, because I also think that that leads to, I know that we're in this era of like gentle parenting, but I think that that leads to less discipline that's rooted in frustration and anger.
Yes. Yes. And I feel like gentle parenting does get a bad name, but really at the root of it, if you're just more conscious and more mindful and intentional about what you're doing and when you're doing it, or more mindful and intentional about, oh, I'm having a feeling. Maybe he is being disrespectful, but I'm also way too upset right now to deal with this. And so the more that you're like sort of tapping into where you're at and what you want to be doing in that moment, the better. I often tell parents, really, the more you can decide ahead of time, the better. Most of the things that happen in your house are not surprises. And so when you come upon them, you could have already decided, okay, when I'm in this space, not decide what your child is going to do. That's more of a rule. Rules are hard, but more of a boundary for yourself that I am not going to react in this way. And so, for example, my daughter, she is a fashionista already. So she decide like none of her clothes are the right clothes in the morning, every morning. Every morning, though, I know we're going to have this. And so I take my deep breath. We look at the closet. I say dress or pants. But that's not getting into the specifics about what pink is the right shade, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The more that you can do that, the better. Now, will you have one for every single thing? No. But the things that you know are kind of rough spots for you and that particular child, because it's different per kid, that you're going to be in a better place to say, nope, I thought about this already. This is the thing that I'm going to do in this moment.
Yeah. I want to touch on something you said about every kid being different.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate more on that piece of it? Because
Yeah.
that is such a big deal that I think being a sibling, right? So my mom has
Yeah.
multiple kids, but I think a big thing that sometimes can fly under the radar is parents of multiple siblings and the need to understand that no child is different, which means you have to be a different parent to each child. So can you just explore that with us a little more?
Yes. And so this is actually huge. And I love that you said that. Every single child you have, you are not the same parent. They're not even experiencing you the same way because child one only ever had you to themselves, and child two has a sibling that they have to split you with. So even if we think about that, that's different. But also, kids come with presets, they come with personalities, they come with their own like timing that feels good to them. Some kids are faster walkers or slower talkers or whatever. And so even just based on those like sort of developmental milestones were different, but humans bring to the table something different. And so the way that they're thinking and processing things is very different. So really allowing yourself to get to know each individual child that you have or that you come into contact with is very important. Even in my practice, I actually I always say I know some stuff, I read some books, but you know you, and so teach me about you. And
Mm,
that's a lot of what our first sessions look like because yes, they might be 11-year-old boy, and so 11-year-old boys tend to like these things, but maybe they don't, and maybe they like very different things, or maybe they have older cousins that they've been influenced by or whatnot. And so you just want to be able to treat each child as their own person, but more than that, treat your relationship with each child as different. And so you have to not just say, because they're a baby, they should be eating on a schedule. Kind of like pay attention to that baby. See if the baby vibes off of a schedule or is actually less moody if you just kind of go with the flow. Or if they like more structure and you don't, that's also okay. It's more about your interaction with them. That is where you're going to get the relationship from, not just by knowing they are this, right? The same way we each have different colors that we favor. I always get mad when the iPhone store, they have like, oh, you can have this pink one. I don't like pink actually.
me neither.
So like, why did you think that? And so like, if you think about it, just as unique of an individual you are, your kid is also.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it takes a lot of sort of work, right? I can imagine to think through, what's my child's. I love that you use the word presets, right? Which is something that everybody can resonate with, right? They just come as they come. And it's really up to you to sort of navigate around that and through that, right? In the earliest stages of psychology and theory and social work, these theorists and these sociologists consistently had these arguments about, is it nature? Is it nurture? Like, which
Yeah.
one is it, right? Like, which one is more impactful, more empowering than the other? And I think what we found over time is that it's always going to be a combination of both, right? And that's exactly what you're describing. Like, your child comes with a preset, but then what is it that you do with that? And how do you cultivate
Yep.
it? And how do you create a relationship with your child to bring out the best in them, right?
Yeah.
Now, what would you say for the kids that are just challenging, right? That
Yeah.
just are challenging in ways that aren't necessarily related to like an intellectual disability or
Sure.
behavior disability, but there's just challenges that exist, maybe because of their experiences or their personality presets,
Yeah.
because some people like pushing buttons. And so, how have you
Sure.
helped parents work through those moments?
Yeah. So often, I think with these kids who are challenging, or even like you said, sort of just strong-willed, or have some behavior or mental health issue that just makes them more difficult to manage than others, often have them first grieve the child that they thought they were going to have. Because usually, when people say that they're like, "Oh, I want a baby," they've already started thinking what that baby would look like, whether it would be a girl or a boy. most of us are thinking healthy baby, happy baby. Most of us are not thinking colic. Most of us are not thinking arguing about what color pink to wear in the morning. And so you really want to be able to kind of mourn like, oh, I thought I was going to have this experience, so that you can accept it and say, okay, I got to move forward with the kid that I have. And then really get to know that kid, because more than anything, when we experience something as a challenge, especially for like the parent-child relationship, it's because there is something about that that is rubbing a value of yours the wrong way. Um, but there's also something about that child that is like, oh, they're doing this on purpose, intentionally, from a positive place, not because they're trying to piss me off, but because, oh, she just really values fashion. For example, this is actually really important to her. And the more that I allow that to be important to me, the challenge actually goes away a little bit. That I say, oh, okay, we have to wake up 10 minutes earlier. I make room for that challenge, kind of like you were talking about. I can adjust around the thing that I thought was challenging, as opposed to trying to like make it not there, to factor it out, kind of like error variance. Like back in research, we used to talk about these things that, okay, here's the average, and everything else outside of that is error. We don't want to treat kids like they have error variance. We want to treat them, oh, okay, I have a new norm, and reset our expectations, reset the way that we decide to interact with that person based on how they're showing up.
Yeah, you said something that I think I've never even considered in this context, right?
Uh,
Is this idea of grieving the child that you thought you were going to have, right?
uh-huh, uh-huh.
And giving parents space to do that. I
Yeah.
think the child, like rearing the child, like getting pregnant, having a kid, and all of these
Mhm.
things are such a big deal
Yeah.
that for a lot of parents, I think that there's a sense of guilt that they carry and feeling like that needs to be something that they do, right? Like, wait, what do you mean I get to grieve the child that I thought that I was
Yeah.
supposed to have? Is that even fair to my kid to say that out loud, to feel that out loud? And I think just as much as it is important to recognize where you're going with your child, it's okay to say, this is not what I expected out
Yeah.
of parenting, out of,
Yeah.
having a kid. Like, I expected life to look very different. And I think
Right.
that some of that is recognizing how much we're really in control of and how much things that are going to exist, like you said, that we cannot necessarily control and or manipulate, but the things that we can take ownership of. And that's
Right.
really, really important for parents to hear. Like, it is okay to be frustrated, to be disappointed, to be
Yeah.
overwhelmed, to be upset that this child, right, or your child may not align with the model version that you had in your head.
Right, right. And I think that, you make a good point, because how often are the things that we think we're going to get into the same as what we expect? Not college, not, the job. I didn't get my shoes, not the movie that we were going to go watch. We go, oh, wait, it's about this and not that. Or, oh, there's more singing in Wicked than I thought there was going to be. Like you just get to sort of like exist in those things a little bit more easily once you can accept, oh, okay, this is what's happening. That's what I thought. For some reason with parenting, it's very different, because people do get sort of bought into that. I have to be sort of rosy glasses about this whole experience. And so, even pregnancy, it's really hard, but like, I'm glowing. No, I'm sweating. It's You know what I mean? And so let yourself have that experience more openly and honestly, because when you are having feelings, all of our feelings are valid, right? And so the more that we can accept those feelings as they're coming up, we can also accept that that feeling exists alongside me loving this child that I actually have. So
Yes.
because the difference is that if you don't acknowledge it, those expectations that you have for a child you never had are put on child you actually do have and love. And so the more that you can mourn that, the easier it is to accept all of them as they are and to pay attention to the good parts. this is sort of an extra piece, but I think that it's easier to understand what I mean in the sense that our brain is always looking for the things that are not so good. That's just how it evolved, because the moment that we find the thing that is not so good, we're safer. Is it easier to expect that, like, if you're in a tree and you're looking down, that that's a lion or that's a rock? It's safer to guess it's a lion. It maybe feels better for the moment to guess it's a rock, but it's safer because if it's a lion, you act different. You get to do all of the things. And especially with parents, that as soon as they find it, they want to fix it. So don't do that. Go sit down. Make sure you do this. And they get to tell the child more of what to do. That sounds good, but it doesn't feel good. And so in relationship, generally, when we can accept the person as they are, whether it's friend, spouse, significant other, whatever, but especially with children who are, you're the roadmap for how they feel about themselves, that they start to feel better when they feel like, oh, okay, you get me. You actually understand why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. And so the sooner you mourn, even when it feels like, oh, that feels bad, you can accept, I love this kid. I'm mourning that kid. You get to just have the kid that you have.
Yes, yes. And that's such a beautiful thing. And I think it's a lot of just understanding the differences in between, like what expectations really are. And I don't think you're saying, don't expect anything from your kid, right? To lower your expectations as a parent. I think that there are differences in just sort of going back to the value systems and sort of the foundations of what you want from your kid. You want to love your kid. You want to respect them. You want them to respect you. You want them to listen to you, but not in a way of like a dictator, but listen to you in a way of knowing that whatever you're saying it out of love, right? The expectations piece is a whole nother ball game, right? Those are the things in which, how does respect look? How does love look? How does listening look, right? And those are the things that you have to tailor per child, because what listening looks like to one may not be what listening and hearing looks like for another, right? And just sort of understanding what that means as kids sort of develop, because I think we're all just trying to get our needs met. Whether it's coming from the parent or the child, like we are all just trying to get our needs met, right? When you have worked with kids in the past or currently, and the child is your identified client, right? Your identified person, how have you incorporated sort of the family dynamics or just the parenting dynamics in that process without sort of, breaching confidentiality or breaching your method to be a safe space for the kid? Like, how important is it to sort of be connected to the parent, and how have you done it in a successful way?
Yeah, so it really depends on the age of the child. I will say the younger that they are, the more it requires the parent's presence, just because they are so dependent on their parent for all of the things. And so I always use a analogy. My professor used to say that, like, if you take a couch out of a flooded basement and you reupholster it and you make it all nice, and then you put it back in the flooded basement, it makes it hard. It's not to say the parents are the cause, but it is to say that if you put it right back in the exact same environment, it's not going to be better. And in fact, it could make it weirder, because now this kid is trying to use strategies that don't actually work for the setting. And so really pulling the parents in, not always to sort of invade the private space. So there might be some room for them to talk about their feelings separately. But the sort of results of that process, that when we get to sort of a place, oh, okay, he's feeling this way because here's some strategies for deep breathing and whatnot that you can practice at home, and to ensure that they understand enough about that process that they then implement the practice at home so that there's a full wraparound. That's usually how it works with the younger kids. For teenagers and up, even up until college age, when parents are still paying, but they, want some insight on what's going on, it's really up to the child, because you do want to protect that as a safe space where they feel like they express all of the feelings that they have and know that it's not going to be parroted back. So usually I'll tell them, even in the sort of introduction to confidentiality, that I'm not going to parrot back who you think is cute or like what's your favorite color. That stuff is yours. But if it comes to the safety concerns, those directly get talked about. And anything else, we will decipher like how and what to tell your parents about this process. And I'm still doing the part where I'm telling the parents, here are some of the strategies that came out of what we talked about so that they can, again, be able to understand them. I had one client a long time ago. This was like over 15 years ago. She was taking deep breaths. And this was an internship, so I didn't know this yet. So she's taking deep breaths, and her mom was like, she comes at me huffing and puffing and I told her to do it. And I said, hold on. Actually, she's trying to take a deep breath. And this is why. And so it's really important that parents understand, like, oh, this is what you're trying to do so that they can adjust and understand, like, this is new normal for us. She's not going to be rolling eyes and yelling at me. She's going to be taking a deep breath. And so I have to respond to that as that and not a sigh.
Yes. And the kids today, and I mean, I'll get your sort of opinion about this.
Yeah.
I think kids today, I don't even know what generation we're on at this point. I think a new one just came out. Like, I cannot keep up. But
Yep.
they have a lot more autonomy because of social media and because they're so connected to like technology and the information that they're learning. So I have, I work with some kids sometimes in like the school setting, and they're coming to me with like textbook language and DSM language and mindfulness tools that they've learned or they've captured in all of these spaces. And I think that has been so difficult for some parents who are completely out of touch, is because that sense of autonomy feels like you're being disrespectful and you're being rude, when in reality, it's just that I just know things and I am more in tune with my feelings and emotions unapologetically, right? That's the biggest thing. You've been doing this work for quite some time. Has there been any specific changes that you've seen over a couple of years ago? The common thread was parents bringing their kids in for X behaviors or X things that are bothering them, to what we are experiencing today.
Yeah, I think to that point about social media, that kids are a lot more tapped in. And, with TikTok especially, I feel like is one of the main areas where kids are learning a lot more about psychological disorders, learning more about neuroatypicality, and learning all of these little jargon language that I feel like their parents aren't as tapped into, because they might be millennials, Gen Xers, these Gen Z folks, they're on their game. And so when they come in, usually it's the kid who says, do I have autism? Because they list off these different like things and like, no, I don't think so. Let's do some testing, but I don't think so. Or they might say, oh, I'm really anxious, or I have a friend who's a narcissist and I want to talk about that. So they're really a lot more tapped in, I think, to what it is that's going on for them, as opposed to reluctantly brought to therapy. And I think the other thing that's also a little bit, and I don't know if this is a good or a bad, but I know a lot of kids will come in wanting therapy because they think it's sort of like a almost like a social like clout kind of, that they're like, oh, I have a therapist, I have somebody who I can talk to about this. And I think it is good, but they also are sort of searching for some sort of like validation for why they're there. And so they might say, of course I have ADHD. So we might end up actually working on something very different than they're expecting. And so then I'm having to talk to the parents about why they don't have what they thought they had, and like what we're talking about. So to your point, I just think it's a little bit of a different entry than when it was the parents who were predominantly bringing them in for something that they thought was wrong.
Fair point. And to your sort of, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I don't know. I don't even know how to answer that question, right? Like, I remember doing a school year. I was doing some work in a school in Camden, and having a lot of what you described, right? I'm neurodivergent. I have ADHD. I have all of these things. And I'm like, okay, fair, fine. Like, well, who was your doctor, right? And it's like, oh, well, I read the symptoms online and it seems like me. And I think that there is a lot of honor in the group of kids, their ability to self-advocate. I'm just trying to figure out at some point how we can create a space for them to just understand the real interworkings of therapy and the real interworkings of it's okay to not have a diagnosis and
Yes.
still have like
Yeah.
quirks and
Yes.
still just want to talk to someone to sort of work through the craziness of life. And I don't know how we do that in this current space that we're in without appearing to be insensitive.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that sort of spectrum, I feel like is the only way that I've found to kind of like finesse it a little bit. So it sounds less like, no, you don't, it's fine, is really to talk to that spectrum that of quirks. Like you don't have exactly all of the things that would require this diagnosis. That doesn't mean that your experience is any less valid. And so let's talk about what you actually are experiencing, even if there's no label, and then what you can do about it, even without the label. And I like what you said in terms of being able to have therapy and space. I'm biased, but I think it's for everyone. I don't think you have to have a diagnosis necessarily to be able to benefit from having some space to think through what's important to you. And I think that's kind of where my sort of client base lands anyway, is that we're really talking about identity. That is a process that everyone goes through, is really formulating like, who am I? And goals, like what are my goals? How do I get to them? And so that's very much a human process as opposed to, a particular different diagnosis. And so I find, at least with my approach, it's easy to be able to kind of talk them down from the TikTok Dr. Ledge, which, rest in peace, TikTok. I don't know if it's going to exist very much longer.
I keep having this joke in my group. I don't have TikTok. I refuse to download it. It's just I can't. I am new school in a way, but very old school in a way. It's like all of these apps, the dings over, like I cannot. Just give me one app and like let me flourish, and that's all I can manage. But I think you're right. Like the TikTok language, their friend language, right? I've seen so many situations where parents are like, well, she thinks that she's doing this because the friend has been diagnosed with this and the friend has that and the friend has a therapist. And so now she wants a therapist. And again, I am with you. I'm very biased. I think therapy is literally for everyone and everyone can benefit from it. It's just that I think we as therapists, right, and clinicians just have to do a better job in sort of those initial conversations and them understanding like, this is just a space for you. And you don't need any sort of heart-wrenching issue or challenge to have a space for you because everyone deserves that.
Right. And that's, I think, really key because, really what it says is that I have to have something massive in order to want this. And no, you just have to want to be heard, which we all do. So there's really no extra qualifier that you need. And even just speaking to the idea that like sometimes it's the friends who have these diagnoses, like it really could be that you guys personality wise are very similar, but that might not have anything to do with her diagnosis. And so it's okay to, again, want the space for yourself to see someone else go, oh, I didn't even know that was an option for me. And to then want it is fine. But also that there's a bit of not necessarily contagion. It's not like you're catching, suicidality from another friend, but you're exploring it more. I actually think that's a good thing, that we're exploring our experiences a little more, or like taking longer with the identity process. I don't know that I like that it starts earlier. It starts at like 8, where they're like, who am I? Like, cool. But I do think that the more that we are opening up this process, it's like hard to put the lid back on the box. That it really then is helpful for these kids to have somebody to talk through that with. And so having more access to therapists and LCSWs and, all of these things in the schools, counselors in the schools, or even taking kids to private therapy actually really, I think, helps them because they are kind of in the wild, wild west, so to speak, of all like access to all of this information, right? And oftentimes the parents, at least that I work with, are older millennials, but often Gen X, some boomer. And so they haven't been taught how to deal with feelings. They don't really know what neuroatypicality is a lot of the times. And so they're not really as able to talk with them about these things. And so professionals are just needed in this space.
Yes, yes, yes. I love it. I love it. In closing sort of our conversation, what do you see and or hope for when it comes to this space of children and adolescents and just sort of their overall well-being and health, especially as times are changing and things are moving very, very quickly? We can break it up into two questions. First is like, what are your sort of, I don't want to use the word predictions, but like, what do you think is sort of going to be a new trend or a new upcoming thing that we're going to have to address? And then the second part of that question would be, what are your hopes for this space?
Yeah, so I think that in terms of trends, because you're right, there is a new generation on the way, that there is this sort of leaning towards, and I think it's with the social climate too. So there's a lot of kids, at least in my therapy room, that are talking a lot about, being conservative, being liberal, that sort of thing. I think they're interacting with the world as it changes. And so just really coming to understand more about what that means for them, especially if they are in a group that they feel like is marginalized.
Mm.
Understanding how people perceive them, I think, is going to be even more magnified. And so, again, for those groups, I think it's going to be really helpful for them to have someone to talk through it with and to understand, how do I move through the world that as it changes, right? And so that's really important. And a lot of kids are concerned about, like, not only just politics, but like the climate change,
Mm.
fires in California. So I have a couple of kids who were thinking about going to school in California next year for college that have actually changed their plans, right? And so again, as the world shifts and changes, and even their opportunities coming out of college for jobs with the economy in its current state, I think they're just very tapped in a different way because of all the social media and because of all of the information that's out there. They're just trying to figure out like where their new place is. And so I think that's going to be helpful to continue to tackle, both with,
Mm.
like I said, in therapy, but also just for schools and other professionals to be able to kind of be aware that that's on the radar.
Yes.
And I think my hope really is that, not only, again, kind of hearkening back to that idea of like not only this access to information, but being able to process it
Mm.
in a helpful way, and knowing that parents, teachers, counselors, like everybody kind of along the line of who's working with these kids, would be able to help them through that as they are figuring out how to work through their own emotions. So we're all kind of doing it for the first time together.
Mm-hmm.
So the more that can be, sort of a process that we figure out together, the better. And I really do think that we're on that path. It's just, it has to be more spread.
Yes, 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 yes. I
Yeah.
did forget to ask you
Yes,
one
ma'am.
question
Okay.
about screen time
Uh,
and children. I want to make sure that I ask that question because there's
yeah.
always a debate about it. And so, what is your perspective on screen
Okay.
time and on children and children
Okay.
having screen time?
Okay. So this is always the hot take. I give that preference, a precedent. But it, so here's what I think, especially when kids are young, obviously, that the more that we can like make sure that they are doing the right thing on these devices and that they're being monitored, the better. When kids get older, I do think that it goes from heavy monitoring, and obviously, like there's a sort of changing of the guard. So it's not all or,
Mm-hmm.
and that there's a process of going from one to the other. But eventually, where you want to be is where you are able to say, here are the things that you should worry about. Be safe, as opposed to restricting access. So you
Mm.
want to be able to teach them how to deal with the world because, again, the world is changing. And so we are not going away from email. We are not going away from social media. We are not going away from access to information being free. And so if you think about it, and obviously 18 is arbitrary, but whenever they become an adult in your eyes and leave your house, the world is theirs. That is
Mm-hmm.
extremely scary if they have not had access to it, with you being sort of aware of what they're being exposed to and how they're interacting with it. So the better that you can give them opportunities to make mistakes, small ones,
Yes.
make mistakes, and do it under your watch, and then be able to give information about, oh, here's how you actually do that, and not be so scared that they're going to see something or do something that you can't fix, right?
Fair.
Being able to have access to a social media that you also can see what they're doing is helpful at the beginning, so that you can say, okay, this wasn't exactly appropriate, or, oh, okay, this person's cyberbullying you. Here's how we handle this. Very different from having that first experience be when you're 20.
Fair, fair, fair. Is
Yeah.
there a starting age range where you feel like we can start to introduce some of this to a kid? And maybe this is just your perspective and it can be anecdotal, but is there a starting point for you where it's like, okay, like this is a good age to start introducing some of the rules and the restrictions and the guidance around screens and technology?
Yeah, I think as soon as they get it. So for example, if you are on YouTube with your small child and they're watching, what is her name? Miss Rachel
Rachel.
or something. Yeah. Miss Rachel, you can say, oh, Miss Rachel is a safe person for us to watch. There are other videos we're not going to watch. Oh, we're not going to watch that one. You can verbalize it without actually having taught them anything. I'm sorry, like,
No, you're fine.
you can teach it to them without necessarily directly talking about it. You can just verbalize it, right? Eventually, you move that up, I would say around like 8 to 10, depending on your child's maturity. You would move that up from just verbalizing it to saying, hey, the internet's a really cool place. We learn a lot from the internet. And there's also some stuff that's not so good. If you ever see something not so good, let me know. Because even though you'll be sitting right there monitoring them, that's already sort of on their radar, right? And then by the time they hit preteen and teen, you can say, when you're comfortable, here is social media. This is the good stuff about it. This is the not so good. And again, let me know if anything ever comes up, and even point them to people can be scary sometimes. Here's the kind of people you want to watch out for. The same way that you might say, you have an email address at school. Don't open the ones that have like a link to them unless you know the person. Like it's just really information. And I think the more that we can give that information to kids without being scared of it ourselves, it is really helpful for them to start to develop their own sort of lexicon about, oh, okay, these are the things that are okay. These are the things that are not. And this is why. Like, I actually know why, as opposed to my mom doesn't understand. She just thinks this is a bad thing. And so they're going to do it anyway, right? Because generally they have apps that you don't know about. And they have like access to things, even if I've had kids whose friends will sign into their Snapchat that they're not supposed to have through their phones. So just like knowing what to do is more important than being like prevented from it, because it's really hard to prevent.
Fair, fair, fair. What an excellent point. And thank you so much. Before
Sure.
we go, what's the fun things that you're doing in your life right now, just outside of your work, right? I know that you have your beautiful babies, but what are you doing for yourself, and sort of how are you enjoying your free space when you have it?
Yeah, sure. So I was really into hiking until it got frigid and cold. And so I'm not doing that so much. But I really do enjoy a good play. So we are close enough where we live. We're close enough to go into the city. And so the last couple of months, I've been really into going to Broadway and seeing some shows. But I also, this weekend, we're going to a concert. So we're going to go see some underground hip hop. So I'm just
nice.
more into like music and theater because I feel like, when you're a young mom with little bitties, you can't do that as much, and they're a little bit older. So we're going to try that. And then when I'm not doing that, we're watching Coco Melon. Yay.
I love that for you. I love that for you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so, so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. And you sort of carving out the space. And I think that you offered some very, very good insight for our audience and our listeners today. And things that are practical that they can actually use and take with them as they're sort of learning more about their children, about themselves, and about how those two relationships intertwine. And so I really appreciate you for that.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
No problem. Thank you so much.